We've seen Joe Burrow for nearly a month of practices returning from his wrist injury. Let's talk about how he's looked and progressed through those 4 weeks.
You are Locked On Bengals, your daily Cincinnati Bengals podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What up, Bengals fans, and welcome to another episode of the Locked On Bengals podcast. I'm your host, Jake Lisco. He's your host, James Rapine. We're the Locked On Bengals podcast on the Locked On Podcast Network, covering your team every day, free on YouTube and everywhere you get your podcasts. If you're new to the show and you're looking for a way to stay up to date on the Bengals throughout the offseason as we finish up the offseason program here over the next couple of weeks and get into training camp a month after that or so, well, Locked On Bengals is a great place to do that. Today, we're going to be discussing how Joe Burrow's rehab progress has looked and how his throws have looked and progressed over 4 weeks, how concerned we should be for the future, because as we know, the Bengals really live and die in terms of true championship aspirations with Joe Burrow. That will be the focus of our discussion today in an episode brought to you by Game Time, where you can save $20 off your first purchase of tickets with promo code Locked On NFL. Check out the app today. Terms apply. And James, you've been there in person, of course, to watch him for 4 weeks. I've seen plenty of clips, but let's talk about how he's looked over that 4-week stretch. Have you noticed significant differences from week to week?
Well, certainly that first week, and if you go back and you check out our podcast, it was, if you didn't know he was coming back from something, you wouldn't think anything of it. But you noted it, and we noted it. There were some wobblers, and it was pretty noticeable that some of those passes were wobbly. And I think over the past few weeks, we've seen a few things. One, from an off-platform standpoint, he's just attacked that, and much more than he did that first week or first couple of weeks. We've seen him throw the deep ball more frequently. And this week, and it was a big barometer, is we saw him go up against defense. Does that accuracy hold up? And I get it. It's 7-on-7. He doesn't have guys in his face, but you just want to see how accurate he can be given the risk, given the state of the injury, all of those things. And I think he keeps checking those boxes, the boxes that you expect, that you hope to see at this stage. Because let's face it, the Bengals don't need Joe Burrow to be 100% and be his best right now. It's the end of May. But you want him to be better at the end of May than he was at the beginning of May when we first saw him. And I certainly think, in just going back and watching some video of him from then to now, you can notice a difference. And a big part for the untrained eyes is just a lack of wobble. Some of his passes have had wobble before, like even when he is healthy, depending on the pass, just not consistently, but here and there. So I'm not saying that there still won't be a wobble here or there, but it was way less frequent this past practice that we saw on Tuesday versus where it was a month ago.
And you even go back to the quotes a month ago, and even then, and this could be his receivers trying to gas him up a little bit through the media, but even then, every single quote from every single receiver that caught passes from Joe Burrow that day in his first practice open to the media that we saw was, oh yeah, he looks like himself. He has his velocity, the accuracy, it's all normal. Mike Gesicki said that might hurt your hands, talking about Joe Burrow's velocity. Kwame Lassiter said he didn't miss a beat. Whatever he did in the offseason worked. Andre Yosevach said you like the amount of power he has on it. I feel like that's what you're really looking for. You'd like to see the velocity. Trent Irwin said he looked like he did last year. He looked smooth. I didn't see anything different. You take that with Zach Taylor's comments yesterday, Dan Pitcher's comments last week that he's not on a pitch count, acknowledging that they designed the practices to be within the parameters of Joe Burrow's recovery and where he's at. And Joe Burrow's own comments that I've referenced several times, that throwing off platform is part of his recovery that he's actively working on, and the Bengals have incorporated that into their practices. And it's all bullish. Like every single thing that we've heard in our Locked On Bengals insiders got a text this morning from you, James, with some more of that from another Bengals veteran that you talked to. And I'll let you expand on that. But the reports from players and coaches throughout this month have been positive, as you'd expect them to be, but both on and off the record with your discussion yesterday that you mentioned.
No doubt. And I think it wasn't just the discussion yesterday. There's been multiple with veterans where they're like, oh yeah, like Joe is, and whether they're making a face or whether, and Joe's not around. It's not like Joe's coming around the corner. It's not like these guys are telling me thinking, oh, I got to gas up Joe. No, I think that they're being honest. And the conversation I had on Tuesday was like, yeah, I was worried about him. And of course, why wouldn't you be? And nods towards in the direction of where Burrow would be potentially. And it wasn't in the locker room, just to be clear, but he was making it clear that it was Joe. And saying that it looks different coming out of his hand. He looks stronger. And I'll leave it there. But it was pretty reassuring, I think. And that's kind of the general vibe around the building right now is, oh, okay. Joe's going to be fine. Joe is good. Joe's good. You know, all of those things. Because if you're a veteran on this team and you're thinking, oh, yeah, I'm playing for a Super Bowl contender. We're going to contend for a Super Bowl this year. Well, it all hinges on that wrist. Everyone knows that. Every single person in that, like, as important as they think they are, they know who the man is and who the guy is that has to be upright and has to be healthy if they're going to have a shot. And so I think they were paying attention very, very closely. And if there was, we'll see how he is. We still have a few months before camp. I haven't gotten any of that. And it's the other way. And I think that's the benefit. I don't think anyone on that team would trash Joe if he was struggling. But I think they would say, at least we have a few more months where he can get even better before camp. I haven't heard that once. It's the other way. It's, man, he looks good. It's great to see the way it's coming off of his hand, all of those things, all of the positive things that you'd hope to hear right now.
Yeah, and you go back to Brad Cragthorpe's quote, again, May 6th, May 7th, whenever that was. Cragthorpe said, I think he looks as quick and athletic as I've seen him. He looked like the Joe Burrow we're used to seeing. I didn't see any difference. I thought the ball came out of his hand well. Confidently, I'm happy where he's at. You've heard similar things. Like I said, you've heard similar things from coaches. You've heard similar things from Zach Taylor, Dan Pitcher as well throughout this process. And the consistency, I think, does mean something. And the fact that we're getting it in May is encouraging. If we, like you said, we're hearing some hedging of bets and saying, yeah, it'll continue to look better, whatever it was. We're not getting that. And so while there is still recovery to be done for Joe Burrow, and you hear that in the way that Dan Pitcher has described practices and Zach Taylor has described practices, and the last couple of weeks you've talked about Joe Burrow taking, a little bit, 5 minutes to not participate in a portion of practice here or there. Those things would be more concerning perhaps, but the way things have gone so far, the concern level feels pretty low, despite what some would have you believe on social media. We'll continue the discussion with an evaluation of that concern level going forward coming up next.
Today's show is brought to you by Game Time. Game Time is the app you need to get right now for your Reds tickets, your future Bengals tickets with the schedule out, or your NBA Finals tickets if you're going to go to Boston, Dallas, or Minnesota. Yeah, Minnesota's still in it. They battled back in Game 4. More on that coming up. But Game Time is the place you need to go for tickets to your favorite events, whether it's concerts this summer, whether it's the Reds at Great American Ballpark. Take the guesswork out of buying tickets with a Game Time. They have last-minute tickets. They have flash deals. They have zone deals. They have tickets on sale up to an hour after the event starts. So maybe you're thinking of going to that opener against the Patriots, but you're like, I don't know if I'm going to be in town for work. And you can wait and get Game Time because they're going to have those last minute ticket deals for you. All you have to do is go to Game Time right now and download the Game Time app in the App Store or Google Play and use the promo code to save $20 off Locked On NFL. It's Locked On NFL, LOCKEON NFL, and new users are going to get $20 off their first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code Locked On NFL for $20 off your first purchase. Download Game Time today. Last minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed.
James, you've watched Burrow in person for 4 weeks. We've talked a
Mhm.
lot about his performance in those individual practices. We're taking a step back here to think about the trends over the 4 weeks and what it means for the regular season and all these things. And some people are still very concerned about the wrist and the risk of re-injury, and it's fair to be because a re-injury would be potentially devastating. But what's the reason to think that he's at a greater risk for re-injury than the injury happening in the first place, which is very rare for a quarterback? We presume this occurred when he was trying to break his fall, Jadeveon Clowney, on a hit the play before his last throw of the season, the Joe Mixon touchdown. Where's your concern level for the 2024 season?
This may shock some people. I'm really not that concerned. I I think one, you're right. Freak accident. How many players fall on their hands and that doesn't happen? How many quarterbacks brace themselves as they're falling and that doesn't happen? Like, it was a pretty unique circumstance, pretty rare thing. And I just think at this point, and when we heard from Joe, which was roughly 4 weeks ago, what did he say? He said he was kind of out of the unknown, out of the woods as far as those really risky scenarios go, where early on there was some unknown and in the re-injury risk and all of those things. And then you have Dr. David Chow, who just Pro Football Doc on Twitter and his YouTube. I think it's Sports Injury Central. I hope I got that right, David. But it is Dr. David Chow. He's like, oh yeah, all these talking heads talking about how his re-injury risk and all these players that are now in quarterbacks. He was like, Joe had the surgery done right away. He didn't wait. He didn't play through it. All of those things, all of these horror stories that you hear, it's much, much different when you have the surgery done right away. And so he expects Joe Burrow to be 100% by the time the regular season rolls around. Like you mentioned, I've watched him throw a ton. No one questions his work ethic or his desire to get back. We have all of these quotes on and off the record from teammates and coaches and all of those things within the organization. Like, there hasn't been any snags. And so at this point, why would I to worry about it? And I get why people are. I'm not saying that, especially if you're not there, not watching them, not talking and having these conversations. But worrying about this is similar to worrying about what could happen just to worry, because he's not 100% yet, but he's getting darn near close. And he's probably about as far along in the process as anyone could have hoped, prayed, and prayed to the Bengals gods for when it happened in November or when he had the surgery or 2 months ago. So he's exactly where you'd hope. And so that's kind of my logic. Injuries do happen, but he's in a good spot. And oh, by the way, Dr. David Chow delivered with pretty darn good news.
Yeah, the David Chow tweet and comment about blood flow to the wrist and the ligament and all that stuff was off the heels of the Pat McAfee show's Darius Butler and I think AJ Hawk. They both had the surgery. It just so happens that, or a wrist surgery. Maybe it wasn't the exact same surgery, and they didn't know what surgery Joe Burrow had exactly. They just know they had wrist issues at some point. But Darius Butler said he had the same surgery and was limited to 50% mobility in that wrist after the surgery, and that caused a bit of an uproar. I think on that same show, AJ Hawk talked about having the same injury. To my knowledge, Darius Butler never aggravated that injury. AJ Hawk never aggravated that injury. They never had recurrences of those wrist injuries, as far as I know. And I could be wrong about that, but I checked as we were discussing, and I didn't find any references to recurrences of those injuries. And those are guys that are dealing with a lot more force more consistently on that joint. And the quarterback, the only way you're getting that happening is in the instance where Burrow's injury occurred, you're getting driven into the ground and too much pressure, too much force gets into that joint when it is exposed and bent in a certain way. And that's how the injury happened in the first place. So there's always risk that that happens again because it happened the first time. But even for these players that prompted the David Chow, Dr. Chow tweet in the first place, where he said, "Oh, the difference here is Burrow had that surgery right away. There's no reason to be worried about blood flow." And what they're talking about with blood flow is that just ligaments have less blood flow in general to them than many other injuries, and blood flow helps to promote injury repair in the body, obviously. And when he's talking about that in response to these other players that had these surgeries that, maybe played through it for a little bit, didn't have the surgery as quickly, it's not necessarily an apples to apples comparison. And in addition to that, what those players, AJ Hawk and Darius Butler, were talking about potentially is not even the same exact surgery. Every surgery a little bit different, every injury a little bit different. And so drawing comparisons to those two players playing different positions, maybe with different injuries in different medical, historical timelines, different recovery processes, everything's so different about these guys. I don't think that it's an apples to apples comparison.
No, it's not. And it's silly when those things go viral, but they do. And on social media, that's just part of it. Locked On Bengals listeners and viewers, and that's okay, right? There are going to be plenty of people that react one way or the other. The good news is you're listening to us, and we're talking to people that are interacting with Joe every single day. Saw him yesterday. He's doing fine. Nothing on his wrist. Was hanging out at his locker on his phone. It's not like he was massaging his wrist or had an ice pack on it or anything like that either. So I think once you see him get out there and once he gets back to full health, and I think he will be. Honestly, Chow said by week 1, I wouldn't be shocked if he's pretty much all systems go for camp and 100% for camp. Maybe there are little things that he'll be working on. But like I said, the one veteran I talked to said it was coming off of his hand as good as he'd seen it come off his hand. And I don't think he was gassing me up. So the concern level is going to be pretty darn high, I think, from a national standpoint, certainly from a fan standpoint. And I get why, because that is the franchise. But I think the concern level inside the building has dropped a ton just because they've seen it over the past 4 weeks and they know exactly what Joe's doing and all of those things. So concern level is about as low as it could be considering the circumstances, Jake.
Well, and you could compare it to the ACL injury, right? The difference there is that for most athletes, there's a lot more time required to develop trust in that knee, that when you plant, the knee is going to hold up, that when you take a hit in your lower leg, if you're a quarterback, that the knee is going to hold up. And Joe's been throwing now for months. Is it months? It's definitely months at this point, right? We think late March or early April.
Late March. It was late March. He said April. He lied. Late March. Yeah.
Late March. So he's been throwing for months in terms of building confidence in the wrist throwing. And then the only thing that's going to remain is breaking his fall and being in that exact same situation where his wrist is the exact wrong angle and there's enough force and, that exact scenario playing out again. But we've seen Joe Burrow take more hits than we want to see him take. If you're rooting for the Cincinnati Bengals success over the last 4 years, his time in Cincinnati. And this is, the first wrist issue that's popped up. So in terms of concern, I think it is similar to the ACL for me, where it's like, if it happens again, that would be bad, but there's no great reason to believe that there's some increased risk of this injury recurring as far as I know. And unless there was a reason for that, I don't see a reason for significantly elevated concern. And the fact that he's had so much time to regain confidence in throwing the football and he's looked good doing it so far mitigates concern in terms of, will his performance be diminished throwing the ball? Because like we've talked about, he looks every bit as athletic and as explosive as he has as an athlete since coming into the NFL. And by all accounts, including Zach Taylor Tuesday after practice, when he said he's throwing with great velocity and power, it sounds like the throwing part of this is going pretty well too.
No doubt about it. And real quick, I'm not really calling Joe a liar. I do think his timeline was just a little wrong when he said early April, but what he considers throwing might be a full throwing program versus some lighter toss. I think that's part of it, because that's when he worked out with Jamar in Cali, was early April. So he had picked up a ball before that. Anyways, will the Bengals offense move to some 12 personnel to protect Joe Burrow? We'll discuss that coming up next. Today's show is brought to you by FanDuel. It's conference finals, time in the Western Conference because it's 3-1 right now. The Timberwolves got it done. And in fact, Minnesota, as I look at the FanDuel odds, well, they're plus 1,500 to win the NBA title, which means completing the comeback against the Mavs, but they are 4.5-point favorites on Thursday night. Mavs at Timberwolves in Minnesota. And maybe you want to wager on that game. Well, you got to get to FanDuel because right now new customers get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That means you could throw $5 on insert whatever Major League Baseball team you want because the Reds are playing as we record this. And if you win, then you're going to get that $150 in bonus bets to use on game 5. Or maybe you think you know exactly who's going to win game 5. We'll throw $5 on it with FanDuel right now by going to FanDuel.com/lockedon. That's FanDuel.com/lockedon, where you can get $150 to bet on point spreads, money lines, player props, and more with any winning $5 bet. FanDuel is America's number one sportsbook.
Zach Taylor, after Tuesday's practice, was asked a couple of questions about the potential emphasis on 12 personnel, meaning 2 tight ends, 1 running back. That's what those 2 numbers mean. 2 tight end sets on the offense. And Mike Hilton was asked about it after practice. Mike Gesicki talked about it a little bit. They clearly have roles defined for the tight ends on the team, James, with Drew Sample having a clear role as a blocking tight end. He's going to probably resume some of his fullback duties this year. I would imagine you'll see some of that where he's going to be in the backfield for split back and shotgun. You might see some true fullback snaps from Drew Sample. And they know what Mike Gesicki's role is, what Tanner Hudson's role is. And we'll see what develops for Eric All and Tanner McLaughlin. But both of those guys could have very specific and carved out roles in this offense as well. A deeper tight end room than they've had probably ever in the Zach Taylor era, I would say. And a better tight end room, we agreed, than they had last year could lead to more 12 personnel, especially as Mike Gesicki can play a lot of slot, can play out wide, can play all over the place. And the Bengals do have a bit of an unsettled situation right now for that 3rd wide receiver spot.
Look at you just taking a shot at Ethan Carter for no reason. That's what you just randomly.
Man,
I'm just kidding.
I remember, like,
I tried to pick the most random tight end that you could have taken a shot at during the Zach Taylor era.
It's funny though, because like the first time I saw a Bengals practice in person was like right when we started this, when I took over this podcast, when you first went to Cleveland like 5 years ago before you came back. And I remember gassing up Ethan Carter because he beat, I wish I could remember who it was. I don't know if it was Jesse Bates or like a corner, like a starting corner. He beat a starting defensive back for the Bengals on a vertical ball in a practice zone. I was like specifically like, man, Ethan Carter, he caught the ball too. He's not just a special teamer. He was just a special teamer, it turned out. But I do remember that play. You mentioned Ethan Carter specifically. I got to shout that out.
I could totally see it being Jesse Bates because Jesse Bates got beat a lot in 2018 and 19 and people forget. Anyways, in practice too. It's called development, letting your young guys develop. Anyways, I do think there's some 12 personnel looks because of Mike Gesicki and because I think they tried to sign Mike Gesicki last year. And now you have the void with Tyler Boyd. Makes even more sense for him to be out there beyond the field. You know what Drew Sample brings, and you drafted 2 tight ends. Yeah, and by the way, obviously Tanner Hudson has Joe Burrow's confidence. I watched 87 catch multiple passes from Burrow on Tuesday. So you have all these guys, Eric All, who you hope can, pun intended, do it all as a tight end. Tanner McLaughlin, who's this pass catching type of player that you think can threaten all 3 levels long term and be that kind of player. Who knows? Maybe he will. And then 3 proven veterans that you've had in your system or that you've respected and tried to get in your system in Mike Gesicki. I think that the 12 personnel stuff makes a ton of sense because there's still a very big question at that wide receiver 3 spot. And we've talked about the evolution, the play action, all of those things. It's pretty easy if you're going to run some of that play action, some of the under center stuff to get Drew Sample and Mike Gesicki on the field together. And that's probably, and I'm just zeroing in on those 2 guys, but it's probably your best package for some of that, or your best tandem for some of that, because of what Gesicki brings as a pass catcher and what Sample brings as a blocker.
Yeah, if Gesicki can live up to 80% of his best years, and you think about his top years at in Miami, the best production he had, and they can really make use of his mismatch in the middle of the field. He's talked about it. When you have, or maybe it wasn't him, somebody with the team has talked about when you have T. Higgins and Jamar Chase outside, and you have a 6'6" guy running the seam. Does that seem more attractive to you than when it's not to take too many unnecessary shots at previous tight ends, but when it's a smaller tight end in that role, or a tight end that isn't as acclimated to catching the ball in that spot, running that seam. So there's that. There's Jeff Hobson pointing out that he's lining up all over the place in the slot out wide. We saw him, or a tight end. I guess we don't know that it was him. I don't know that it was him because his number was obscured, but a tight end lined up out wide by himself with 3 receivers on the opposite side of the formation in a clip that made it to Twitter from practice on Tuesday. And Hobson saying in motion quite a bit, and even in line as well, which what shouldn't be expected to be a majority of Gesicki's snaps, but I think we'll see at least a little bit. And it's always been part of his snap profile, just given his size. But have you noticed all the motion as well with Gesicki? Have you noticed how much he's lined up in line over the practices you've seen?
Not specifically Gesicki with the motion. I have noticed more motion in general, which I think is interesting. Like everyone talks about the play action and stuff, but you mentioned motion, and it's like, yeah, I mentioned by the way, when I take videos, just to be very clear, my goal is to make sure that the Bengals coaching staff does not get mad at me. So what I do is I hit record right before the snap. My goal is not to show, because then I get in trouble. And I'm not trying to get in trouble, because I want to have a good rapport, and that's how that works. So you might see other clips from other people. I can't control what they do. I can control what I do. So, and that's not for you, Jake. That's for everyone that checks out on social. But there has been motion, and I think that makes sense. It makes sense. Gesicki in motion is interesting. I have seen him line up in line. I haven't kept track of that, but I do think they'll use him there at least some. They did with Hayden Hurst. They've done with some of these guys. And I think back to when he was introduced, he said, hey, I'm willing to block. These teams have never put me in those positions in line that I've played for, but I'm more than willing to do it. So, and he's big enough. Like I know the measurables are the measurables, but like you see him, he is big enough to do some of that. It's not like he would stand next to Hayden Hurst, or he's much bigger than Irv Smith Jr., but he's not underwhelming in that department, and he's certainly athletic enough to get it done, at least enough, give you enough as a blocker.
Now, the question was directly asked to Gesicki. Is this an influx of more 2 tight end sets for the Bengals? He said, well, ask me that in August. We just got through our first 7-on-7 of the season, which fair. Zach Taylor asked about it after practice as well. Kind of was a little coy, I would say, with his answer, and maybe a little bit guarded. Would you agree with that assessment, James? Like he didn't want to give too much away, and he never does at this point. Like he's learned his lesson about saying too much to the media, I think, going back to the AJ Green injury in his first year. But would you say that he was maybe being a little coy and trying to downplay it?
When you ask him about scheme, what he'll do is he'll explain the benefits of doing that particular thing. Like, oh yeah, well, if they play too high, then you want to try to find this hole or that. But he's not going to be like, oh, well, this is what we're going to do. Mm-hmm. And so with this, it was like, yeah, what are the benefits of playing more 12? And he's like, well, yeah, if you play 2 tight ends, this is what, and it's a very general, like, this is exactly what happens, high level thing, not their logic. And it does make sense. By the way, if I'm them, I would lean into all these different scenarios with us there, because they practice most of the time with no one around. Mm-hmm. And so just let's do our play action day and our 12 personnel day when the media is here. So everyone thinks that we're going to completely change our offense. They went empty again on Tuesday. I mentioned it on yesterday's show, but it's not like they haven't gone empty at all. But no, he was coy, to your point.
I wonder how much they really plan that. I imagine not that much, but I'm sure there's some things they hold back for when the media isn't watching. Just to wrap up, go ahead. You have one other thing you want to say. I can see it.
No, just the Joe Burrow play action deep ball to Brad Robbins.
Brad Robbins. Oh,
Brad can run, hater.
yeah. Okay.
Oh, all right.
Just to wrap up here with another Mike Hilton quote, or maybe the first Mike Hilton quote we've talked about today. I was thinking earlier about he was talking to Dan Horde when Dan Horde was reporting Burrow, and we saw Dan be like, Mike, I'm coming to you. And he turns the camera to Mike Hilton, and you get a little comment from Mike Hilton about Joe Burrow saying he looked good or something like that. But Hilton also said after the practice that they saw a lot of 12. He thinks that the Bengals are going to mix it up. He talked about Gesicki and how you match up with that mismatch kind of player. If you treat him as a receiver and you get a 5'9" Mike Hilton guarding a 6'6" Mike Gesicki, it might not go well for opposing teams that have 5'9" slot corners.
It won't go well for a 5'9" guy. I'm 5'9". I stood next to Mike Gesicki on Tuesday.
You're giving up at least a head of height there.
I said, I'll dunk on you, little man. And he walked away.
And you take that in combination with the comments from the coaches and what we've seen in practice so far, and Zach Taylor saying, you got to see how they're going to answer 12 personnel. Are they going to match it with base? Are they going to match it with a nickel corner? How are they going to treat that tight end? And you start to get an idea of how the Bengals could use that threat and mix and match personnel a little bit more this year. So
go ahead.
I was just going to say there's quite a bit there that we'll continue to monitor over the course of the offseason and training camp.
Last thing from me, in real talk, I didn't say that to Mike, but we were talking about basketball. And I'm going to try to interview him about this. He was like, check out my highlights. So Mike Gesicki apparently has some pretty darn good highlights from high school. And so for those wondering about his athleticism, he said, YouTube me. And I was like, okay, I will. I haven't yet. But maybe that's a homework assignment for some of our listeners. It tagged me in those clips on social.
Now all of our listeners that actually make it through all of the episode will know to go look for that and tag you in it. Like you said, there's probably the most overlap between NFL players and basketball experience at the tight end position, right?
Got to be.
I
mean, it's
quarterback.
Maybe? I would say it's probably three. It's quarterback, wide receiver, and tight end.
Yeah. Probably some corner.
Running backs are too short.
Yeah.
Usually.
That's going to do it for this episode of the Locked On Bengals podcast. Until next time, appreciate you listening. Hoo day, and have a good one.